Don't sign that, Dad. The little black girl's hand closed around Richard Whitmore's wrist so tightly that the silver pen stopped less than an inch above the paper. Around the boardroom table, no one breathed. The billionaire looked down at her soaked sneakers, her trembling fingers, the cracked blue lunchbox pressed against her side. Then he looked at the final page of the contract, and something in his face changed. 20 minutes earlier, the 74th floor of Whitmore Tower had been so quiet it felt sealed off from the rest of Chicago. Rain slid down the glass walls in thin silver lines, blurring the city lights below. Inside the executive boardroom, everything had been arranged with expensive precision. Black walnut table, crystal water glasses, leather folders placed at identical angles, and one thick contract resting in front of Richard Whitmore like a verdict. He had signed thousands of documents in his life. Acquisitions, mergers, trust amendments, settlements, board approvals. His name had moved factories, collapsed rivals, built hospitals, bought silence, protected reputations. But this one was different. Preston Vale, his longtime attorney, stood at his right shoulder with both hands folded, his gray suit perfectly still. "It's routine, Richard," he said, his voice smooth enough to make danger sound polite. "A temporary safeguard. Nothing more." On Richard's left, Vivian Cross touched the back of his chair, leaving behind the faint smell of gardenia perfume, a scent too sweet for the cold room. "You've had a hard year," she murmured. "Let the people who love you protect what you built." Richard did not answer. His reflection stared back at him from the dark window, older than he remembered, paler beneath the boardroom lights. 53 years old, worth more than most small countries, and still unable to sleep in the lakefront mansion without hearing empty rooms answer him. He reached for the pen. At the far end of the table, a junior aide avoided his eyes. One of the security monitors near the wall flickered once, showing the hallway outside. For half a second, the feed cut to black, then returned. No one seemed to notice except the child, standing barefoot in the elevator lobby, clutching a blue lunchbox with both hands. She had slipped past the first guard when a catering cart rolled through. She had waited until the second guard turned toward his radio. By the time anyone saw her, she was already running. The boardroom doors opened with a sharp crack. "Sir, stop!" a guard shouted. But the girl was fast in the desperate way only frightened children can be fast. She slid between two chairs, nearly fell, caught herself on the edge of the table, and grabbed Richard's wrist just as the pen lowered. "Don't sign that, Dad," she whispered this time, her voice small but steady. Richard froze, not because of the contract, not yet, but because no one had called him that in a voice he recognized and feared at the same time. Preston stepped forward. "Remove her." Vivian's hand tightened on the chair. Richard looked at the girl's face. "Who sent you?" The child swallowed. Her braids were damp from the rain. Her coat was too thin for January. "Nobody," she said. "That page wasn't there this morning." Preston gave a soft laugh. "She cannot possibly know that." The girl lifted one shaking finger toward the contract. "Then why don't the staple holes match?" Richard looked down, and for the first time, he saw the last page was pinned a little crooked, as if it had been added by a hand that thought no one small enough would ever notice. For a moment, Richard did not move. The room seemed to shrink around the crooked page, around the small brown hand still wrapped around his wrist, around the silver pen suspended above a signature that suddenly felt heavier than ink. Then Preston Vale smiled, and the spell almost broke. "Mr. Whitmore," he said gently, as if speaking to a client recovering from anesthesia. "Children notice odd things. They don't understand binding documents." His fingers slid over the final page with practiced ease, not snatching it away, not hiding it, just resting there like a man casually protecting paper from a draft. That was what made it worse. Everything he did looked normal. Vivian Cross stepped beside Richard and lowered her voice. "She's soaked. She's frightened. This is probably not even her idea." Her gardenia perfume drifted over the table again, sweet and soft, and Richard remembered smelling it on his coat that morning before she had even come near him. He looked at her, but only for a second. "Who brought her up here?" he asked. "No anger," No shouting. Just one quiet question. The head of security touched his earpiece. We're checking now, sir. Zoe's hand slipped from Richard's wrist when a guard reached for her shoulder. She pulled away, not wildly, not like a child throwing a fit, but with a stiff little dignity that made Richard's eyes sharpen. Don't touch my lunchbox, she said. The guard stopped. The cracked blue box sat open on the marble floor beside her wet sneakers, its plastic hinge bent, its lid trembling slightly from the draft under the door. Inside, Richard glimpsed folded paper, a red crayon worn flat on one side, and something black with a spiderweb crack across the glass. Phone, maybe. Old. Too old for a child who should have been carrying crayons and crackers. Preston saw Richard looking and gave a small laugh. This is exactly how these things work. A sentimental prop, a few rehearsed phrases, then a demand. Zoe turned her face toward him. I didn't ask for money. Not yet, Vivian said softly. The words were gentle, but they landed like a slap. The rain tapped against the boardroom windows. Somewhere near the credenza, a spoon touched the side of a coffee cup with a tiny silver click. In that small sound, Richard noticed the junior aide at the end of the table staring at the security monitor instead of the child. The hallway feed had frozen. The timestamp in the corner read 9:13 a.m., but Richard's watch said 9:18. 5 minutes were missing. Leave the monitor as it is, Richard said. Preston's smile thinned. Richard, surely you don't intend to indulge this. Richard did not answer. He looked at Zoe. How did you know about the staple holes? Zoe swallowed. Her eyes flicked toward Preston's hand, still spread over the bottom of the page. Because my mom taught me to check things people think don't matter. Your mother works here? Richard asked. Zoe's chin lifted a fraction. She did. Something passed across Preston's face so quickly that most people would have missed it. Vivian did not miss it. Richard did not miss Vivian missing it. And where is your mother now? He asked. Zoe's fingers tightened around the broken handle of the lunchbox. Downstairs, she said. They said she was lying. Preston exhaled as though tired of cruelty being mistaken for patience. Mr. Whitmore, this child has been coached. We should call police. Not hold up a corporate vote because of a janitor's daughter and a fantasy. Zoe looked at Richard then, not begging, not crying, simply forcing herself to be brave in a room built to make people like her feel small. If it's the same page, she said, tell him to move his hand. The boardroom went silent. Preston did not move. Richard lowered his eyes and saw that the lawyer's thumb was not covering the words, or the signature line, or even the clause itself. It was covering one tiny printed number in the bottom corner, where page W19 should have matched every page before it, but didn't. Richard kept his eyes on Preston's thumb for 1 second longer than politeness allowed. No one else moved. The rain on the glass had softened to a steady hiss, and in that hiss the room seemed to wait for a man worth billions to decide whether he would believe his attorney of 20 years or a little girl with rainwater dripping from the hem of her coat. Move your hand, Preston, Richard said. It was not loud, but it carried to every corner of the boardroom. Preston's smile remained, but the skin around his eyes tightened. Of course. He lifted his hand slowly, almost lazily, as if proving he had nothing to hide. The tiny printed code at the bottom corner appeared.
W 19.
Richard looked at the page before it.
W 17.
Then the page before that.
W 17.
Then the page before that.
W 17.
A board member shifted in his chair. Vivian's fingers brushed the pearl bracelet on her wrist. Once, twice. A delicate little motion that looked like nerves pretending to be elegance. Different print batch, Preston said before anyone asked. The final page was updated after compliance review. Zoe shook her head. No, every adult turned toward her. The word had been too small to be rude but too certain to ignore. Richard studied her face. Why no? Zoe reached into the lunchbox, but this time she did not open it all the way. She kept her body angled, shielding the contents like a child protecting the last piece of bread at school. From under the folded paper, she pulled out a small white receipt, creased down the middle and stained at the corner with something that looked like coffee. She placed it on the table with 2 fingers. My mom copied the old page at 6:41. Preston's expression barely changed, but his jaw moved once. That proves nothing. The receipt says W17, Zoe said. Richard picked it up. It was a copy room receipt from the 61st floor service printer, dated that morning. 6:41 a.m. Secure paper stock W17. 1 page. Cash account override. Richard turned it over. On the back, in hurried blue ink, someone had written, "Page switched after 7. Do not let him sign." "Who wrote this?" he asked. Zoe's voice lowered. "My mom." Vivian stepped closer. "Richard, for all we know, her mother created that note after the fact." "She didn't," Zoe said. "She wrote it before they took her phone." Preston looked at her then, not like a lawyer looking at a nuisance, like a man recognizing a locked drawer he thought had already been emptied. Richard noticed. "They took her phone?" he asked. Zoe nodded once. "But not the old one." Her fingers moved to the cracked black phone inside the lunchbox. At that same moment, Preston's own phone lit up on the table. He turned it face down too quickly. Richard saw only 3 words before the screen disappeared. "Is it done?" Richard did not reach for Preston's phone. He only looked at it, and that was enough to make the silence change shape. Preston slid the device into his jacket pocket with the calm of a man putting away reading glasses. "A client matter," he said. "Confidential." Vivian exhaled softly, as if the whole room had become embarrassing rather than dangerous. "Richard, this is exactly what I meant. You're being pulled into a performance." Her voice was low, elegant, almost kind. She turned to Zoe with a sadness that looked expensive. "Sweetheart, whatever your mother told you, adults sometimes misunderstand things when they're frightened." Zoe stood beside the chair that was taller than her shoulders, one hand gripping the cracked blue lunchbox, the other curled around the old phone inside it. She did not answer Vivian. That seemed to irritate the room more than if she had shouted. A board member in a navy suit leaned forward and folded his hands. "Mr. Whitmore, with respect, we have shareholders waiting on this authorization. A child's accusation, especially one involving a former cleaning employee, cannot derail a governance vote." Former cleaning employee. The words landed with a soft, polished cruelty. Zoe's chin dipped for half a second, then rose again. The head of security stepped closer, careful and professional. "Sir, protocol requires that we remove unauthorized minors from restricted floors. We can keep her downstairs with guest services until police or child services arrive." He said it properly. He said it like safety, but everyone in the room understood what it meant. Get her out. Make her smaller. Put the glass walls and elevators and badges back between her and the truth. Richard watched Zoe's fingers tighten until the plastic handle bent inward. He saw the wet cuffs of her jeans, the way her sneakers left dark half-moons on the marble, the red crayon mark on her thumb. He also saw Vivian's eyes move from the lunchbox to Preston, then away. "Zoe," Richard said quietly, and the room seemed startled that he knew her name without asking. "What is your mother's full name?" Preston spoke before she could. "Richard, I strongly advise against collecting personal statements without counsel present." "I have counsel present," Richard said. Unfortunately, the smallest ripple moved through the room. Preston's smile returned, thinner than before. Zoe swallowed. "Naomi Elise Carter." Richard's face did not break, but something behind his eyes tightened as if a door had been shut too quickly. Vivian noticed. Preston noticed Vivian noticing. "Naomi Carter was terminated for cause," Preston said, now using the colder voice people used when paperwork became a weapon. "Unauthorized access to confidential documents, refusal to comply with, internal investigation, and escalating behavior toward executive staff." Zoe looked at him. She was scared. "Many employees are scared when they're caught," Vivian said gently. "That doesn't make them truthful." The rain tapped harder against the glass. Somewhere beyond the closed boardroom doors, a service elevator chimed, ordinary and distant. Zoe opened the lunchbox just enough to slide out a worn plastic badge. It skidded across the table and stopped near Richard's hand. Naomi Carter, Night Custodial, Whitmore Dominion Group. Across the bottom, in red letters, someone had stamped terminated. Zoe's voice stayed small, but it made the room go still. My mom said if they used that word, you'd stop listening. Preston gave a controlled nod, as if pitying her. And yet here we are listening. He turned to security. Please escort her to the lobby. For one brief second, it looked like he had won. The guard moved. Vivian's shoulders relaxed. The board member closed his folder. Then Richard looked down at the badge again and saw what Preston had missed. Naomi's access level was still active, and the last scan printed in tiny gray letters showed she had entered floor 61 at 6:38 a.m., 3 minutes before the copy receipt. Richard read the tiny gray line once, then again the way men read numbers when they are praying the numbers will change. Floor 61, 6:38 a.m., 3 minutes before the copy receipt. The badge lay on the polished table between his hand and the contract, a small piece of plastic with a woman's life reduced to a job title and one red stamped word. For the first time that morning, Richard did not look at Preston for an explanation. He looked at Zoe. "Show me the rest," he said. The guard stopped beside her, uncertain now. Zoe did not move until Richard nodded once, not impatiently, not kindly, but with the seriousness of a man who finally understood that the smallest person in the room was carrying the heaviest thing. She lifted the lunchbox onto the edge of the table. The blue lid creaked when she opened it. There was no sandwich inside, no apple slices in a plastic bag, no juice box, nothing a child should have brought to a long morning in a skyscraper. There was only the folded page, the old black phone with the cracked screen, the copy receipt, and a red crayon worn down almost to paper. Zoe took out the folded page with both hands. "My mom said not to let anyone bend it again," she whispered. She placed it in front of Richard. He unfolded it slowly. The paper did not match the page in the contract. It was softer at the crease, marked by a pale brown coffee stain near the word trustee. At the bottom corner, the watermark read W17. On the contract in front of him, the last page read W19. A small sound came from outside the boardroom, the service cart wheels rolling over the marble, then fading toward the elevators. For a few seconds, the world sounded ordinary again, as if coffee was being poured somewhere, as if rain was only rain, as if a little girl's mother had not risked everything to save a man who had forgotten her name was still dangerous in his building. Richard touched the coffee stain without thinking. Something old moved in his memory. Naomi at a diner booth years ago, laughing because he had spilled coffee on a lease agreement while promising he would never become the kind of man who let paperwork decide what people were worth. He pulled his hand back. "This is not an updated page," he said quietly. Preston's voice came too quickly. "Richard, secure stock changes throughout the day. That is not unusual." Zoe picked up the old phone. "Then why did he call my mom before sunrise?" Preston went still. Zoe pressed the cracked screen. It flickered weakly, then lit. One voicemail sat half-saved, not under a name, only a number. She tapped it before anyone could stop her. Static breathed through the speaker. Then Preston's voice, low and controlled, filled the room. "Naomi, listen carefully. Bring me the page before Mr. Whitmore sees it, and this can still end quietly." Richard's eyes lifted from the phone to the man who had stood beside him for 20 years. Richard did not speak for several seconds after Preston's voice died inside the cracked phone. The room waited for anger, for an accusation, for the kind of command that made assistants run and attorneys sweat. But Richard Whitmore had not built an empire by showing people the exact moment he understood they had lied to him. He only reached for his water glass, lifted it, and set it back down without drinking. "Battery is low," he said quietly. "Someone get the child a charger." Preston blinked once, almost relieved by the ordinary sentence. Vivian's shoulders eased by half an inch. To them, it sounded like Richard was buying time because he still wasn't sure. Only Zoe noticed that he had not taken his eyes off Preston since the voicemail played. "Richard," Preston said, smoothing his tie, A partial recording without context can be manufactured. She could have cut off the beginning. Naomi Carter may have been attempting to extort the firm. Zoe's face tightened, but she did not raise her voice. My mom doesn't want money. Richard turned to her. What does she want? Zoe hugged the lunchbox against her coat. For you not to sign. And for them to stop saying she's crazy. The words made something small and painful move behind Richard's ribs. He looked away first. Not because she had failed to convince him, but because she had. At the credenza, a young assistant poured coffee with a shaking hand. A spoon touched the side of a cup. One bright little sound in a room full of expensive silence. Rain kept sliding down the glass, blurring the city below until Chicago looked less like a place and more like a warning. Richard took his phone from the table and called no one by name. Ellen, he said when the line connected, his voice flat, controlled. Pull the 61st floor hallway footage from 6:30 to 7:10 this morning. Not the copy room. Hallway only. Send it to the secure boardroom screen. And Ellen, do not route this through legal. Preston's eyes narrowed. That would be improper. Then you'll have plenty of time to explain why, Richard said. Vivian touched his sleeve. You're tired. This is exactly why we prepared protections. Richard looked at her hand until she removed it. The screen at the front of the room flickered. Hallway footage appeared. 6:36 a.m. empty corridor. 6:37. A cleaning cart rolled into frame. 6:38. Naomi Carter entered with her badge, shoulders hunched, moving like someone who hoped not to be seen. Preston leaned back slightly, as if the footage helped him. Then Zoe stepped closer to the screen. Wait, she whispered. The glass. Richard followed her finger. The copy room door had a narrow black reflective strip along the edge. In it, faint but visible, stood the reflection of a man outside the camera's direct view. Gray suit, black folder, Preston's posture. The timestamp read 6:35 a.m., 3 minutes before Naomi arrived. Richard stared at the reflection, then at Naomi's small figure on the screen, and understood with a coldness that made his hands still. The woman he had allowed them to destroy had been trying to warn him, and the man standing beside him had been guiding the knife. Richard did not turn away from the screen. He let the reflection remain there long enough for everyone to see it, long enough for Preston to understand that the room had changed without anyone raising a voice. Then Richard touched the conference phone and said, Ellen, leave the footage on pause. The tiny red camera light above the boardroom screen blinked once, then steadied. Preston's hand moved toward the back of a chair, not gripping it, just resting there. Reflections are unreliable, he said. Any first-year associate could argue that. Richard nodded slowly, as if the point were fair. Then we won't argue the reflection. Vivian looked at him. Richard, what are you doing? Asking a question. He turned toward Preston with the same calm face he wore in hostile acquisitions. You said the final page was updated after compliance review. Correct. Who approved the update? Preston did not hesitate. Corporate compliance. Name. A faint silence opened. The rain had softened again, and somewhere under the table, a phone began to vibrate against wood. Once, twice. No one reached for it. Zoe looked at the sound, then at Preston's jacket pocket. Richard noticed. Name, he repeated. Preston smiled thinly. Ellen Brooks processed the paper stock request. That is not what I asked. The vibrating stopped. Vivian picked up the water glass in front of her, then set it back down without drinking. The rim left a perfect circle on the coaster. Zoe stared at it, then whispered, He said her name wrong. Every adult in the room looked at her. Richard lowered his gaze. What? Zoe's eyes stayed on Preston. My mom said the lady from compliance is Mrs. Brooke. Not Brooks. No S. Preston gave a quiet laugh. This is absurd. She wrote it on the copy receipt, Zoe said. She opened the lunchbox again and took out the creased slip, smoothing it with her palm. M. Brooke. She told my mom the paper stock didn't change today. Richard took the receipt, but instead of reading it aloud, He placed it in the center of the table beside the W-19 page. "Preston," he said, "call compliance and ask Mrs. Brooke to confirm the update." Preston's eyes shifted almost imperceptibly toward Vivian. There it was. Not fear. Calculation. "I don't think putting an employee on the spot in front of a child is appropriate." Richard's expression did not change. "Then step into the hall and make the call on speaker." No one moved. The boardroom door stood 20 feet away, polished steel handle shining beneath the recessed lights. Preston looked toward it as if measuring distance. Richard looked too. "Before you go," he said, "leave the contract here." Preston's hand stopped on the chair. The room held its breath. Zoe's small fingers closed around the red crayon in her lunchbox. Not to write, only to hold something that belonged to her. Richard reached for the final page and slid it away from Preston's side of the table. "Actually," he said, "I'll ask Ellen myself." Preston's phone vibrated again, louder this time. Vivian closed her eyes for half a second. Richard did not look at the phone. He looked at Zoe. "You remembered one letter?" Zoe shook her head. "No, sir. I remembered because my mom said people who lie add things to make small people doubt themselves." That sentence did what the footage had not. Took the room away from Preston. Richard lifted the conference phone, pressed the intercom, and said, "Ellen, connect me to Marjorie Brooke in compliance." On speaker. Preston's face remained composed, but his hand finally left the chair as if the wood had burned him. And when he looked at Zoe, he saw Richard Whitmore, standing beside her now, quiet as stone, and understood she was no longer alone. The line clicked once, then filled the room with the faint hiss of an office phone somewhere far below them. "Compliance, Marjorie Brooke speaking." Her voice was steady, ordinary, unaware that 74 floors above, a room full of executives had stopped breathing. Richard leaned toward the speaker. "Marjorie, this is Richard Whitmore. Did your department approve a final page update on the Dominion Trust agreement this morning?" A pause. Papers shifted on the other end. "No, sir." Preston did not move. Vivian's eyes lowered to the untouched glass of water. Richard asked, "Did you authorize secure paper stock W-19 for that document?" "No, sir," Marjorie said, slower now. "That file was locked yesterday at 5:42 p.m. on W-17 stock. No compliance update was issued this morning." Richard looked at Preston. "Thank you, Marjorie. Stay available." He ended the call. No one spoke. The red camera light above the screen blinked softly, recording the silence Preston had nowhere to put. Then Zoe tugged lightly on Richard's sleeve. She had not done it like a child asking for comfort. She did it like someone reminding an adult not to stop one step before the truth. "There's one more," she said. Richard looked down. "One more what?" Zoe opened the old phone again. The cracked screen flickered, dim and stubborn. "My mom said if they said the paper was all they changed, play the backup." Preston's head turned. Not sharply, just enough. But Richard saw it. Zoe tapped a folder labeled with a date. A video opened. It was shaky, filmed from low inside a cleaning cart, the view half blocked by a yellow microfiber cloth. Still, it showed the copy room doorway. Preston stood with Vivian near the shred bin. Vivian's voice came first, soft and impatient. "Make sure the inheritance exclusion stays. If the child appears later, she gets nothing." Richard's face emptied. Preston answered, "Once he signs, any undisclosed biological claimant is barred from trust standing. The girl and her mother can talk all they want after that." For the first time all morning, Vivian Cross looked truly afraid. Zoe held the phone with both hands, but her voice was almost a whisper. My mom didn't know what that meant. She only knew they were talking about a child. Richard reached for the contract. His fingers found the final clause buried beneath the definitions, the one written so cleanly it looked harmless. Any biological claimant not disclosed prior to execution shall be excluded from future trust standing. He read it once, then again. His skin went pale beneath the boardroom lights. The pen, the company, the fortune, the woman beside him, the lawyer he had trusted for 20 years. all of it pulled away from him at once. What remained was a little girl in wet sneakers holding proof that his name had almost been used to erase her. "Zoe," he said, but nothing followed. He could not ask the question. He could not bear the answer. Zoe reached into the lunchbox and took out a worn photograph, its corners soft from being hidden too long. She slid it across the table. Richard saw himself younger, standing outside a small diner beside Naomi Carter, his arm around her shoulders, both of them laughing at something the camera had missed. On the back, in his own handwriting, were the words, "For Naomi, if our little girl ever asks, tell her I wanted to be there." Richard sat down slowly as if his bones had forgotten their purpose. Vivian's lips parted, but he lifted one hand, and she stopped. The room belonged to him again, but his voice did not rise. He placed the phone, the photograph, and the altered contract side by side on the table. Then he looked at the head of security and said, calmly, "Seal this floor. Call my attorney."